Ahoy! So there's a new weapon on the PTR that you may have heard of.
I fear no man, but that thing, it scares me.
We're of course talking about Boltcaster, and today I want to take a bit of a deep dive on this artifact. I've actually tested it, I've tested the damage scaling, I've tested how the CC actually works, and everything surrounding that. We're gonna get into all of those different tests, and by the end of that hopefully have a conclusion on how good this thing really is. A quick overview if you haven't seen the artifact yet. The first passive is Electrified, which is 99% of your damage is converted to lightning, and lightning damage in general is increased by 20% for both weapons. The second passive is Bolt. Lightning damage versus full health targets inflicts a 0.5 second stun. This does not seem to apply on your secondary weapon if that is using lightning damage, so this only seems to apply for Boltcaster. Along with that, you have Shirking Lightning, which is kind of okay if you're dodging any ranged attacks. It's not as good as Attunement for most players, but still a decent chunk of extra damage. And you have Enchanted, which is also a very strong perk. You cannot add a gem slot, but you can add Keenly Jagged, which makes this very comparable to Syncretic Bow. So the very first thing we tested was the stun. This has an 0.5 seconds duration, and it only procs at full health, so it has some conditions tied to it. It's not very long at all, it's more a setup for your next shot essentially. But because it is a stun, it can interrupt abilities. So any ability that is not an iframe in itself will be interrupted. For example, if somebody is charging at you with a Great Axe, they will be stunned and their ability will be interrupted and go on cooldown. So very strong counter mechanic in itself. The stun is also not limited to a single target. This means, for example, at the beginning of an arena, if you drop a rain of arrows on multiple enemies, all of them will be stunned. Likewise, in a war on a point, if you drop rain on that and some of the players on the point are getting healed to full in that moment from a sacred, for example, then all of them that are at full health will be stunned. Additionally, this comes with 0 internal cooldown. You can hit people twice in a row with a stun as long as they get full health in between, and they will immediately get stunned again. This is obviously extremely strong, especially if someone's potting in between or something and they get back to full health and you just immediately stun them again. And their cousin also pointed out to me that the stun can actually be extended with Lost Stopwatch. That means you can double the duration of the stun to 1 second. Now the stopwatch comes with downsides. You can't have protection plus stamina recovery on it, and also it reduces your base damage by 5%. But I want to quickly show you the limit testing that we did with this.
Kill him as well.
I'm trying to leave. I'm trying to leave the sacred.
No. Sacred locked.
Leave, bullhead.
No.
You almost made it. You're close.
At this point, it would be like a buff to the bow if they extended the sacred duration.
So because there's no internal cooldown and we can increase the duration to 1 second, if we deal low enough damage and we deal less damage than the sacred heals for, well, we can basically permanently stun lock someone in their sacred ground until the sacred runs out. Sure, this won't be possible if they're not healing back to full, but think for example if the healer is healing a tank instead and you're shooting the tank, even if you're dealing more damage, the tank is consistently going to go back to full health fairly frequently and you will be able to stun them fairly frequently. Now in my opinion, a stun shouldn't be on a ranged artifact in the first place. I think that is a huge balance concern in itself, but that's just the first part on the story. I don't really want to go deeper on this because I think we need to talk about the damage aspect. Before we do that, if you're interested in more info like this, consider subscribing, because in the next days we'll have to talk about the entire int gem changes, which are a massive, really game-changing story in themselves too. Also, thanks to my patrons for making videos like this possible. Feel free to support me there if you want to support my work. Now when it comes to testing this bow, I wanted to compare it against what most bow players are using at the moment, which would be the Syncretic Bow. I didn't have that on PTR, so I just crafted one with the materials, with these same perks, being Enchanted as well as Attunement and Keenly Jagged. My Boltcaster didn't have Keenly Jagged because I didn't have the Dark Matter for it on PTR, but at the end of the day it doesn't make much of a difference because it should just scale with the normal damage output anyways. So it would be almost the same for both. I didn't use lightning or thrust damage on my ring, and I also did not use harnessing on my armor. My goal here was not to maximize the potential damage that I can do in a single shot, but to see how the damage compares between both weapons. That also means I skipped some other damage increases like passives from the bow or arrows because it really doesn't add anything. We just want to see the percentage change. Now here's all the different things I compared, because I went beyond just Boltcaster here just to have a good idea of what's going on in the new patch in general. I tested the Runewood Bow, which is basically our placeholder for Syncretic Bow, with 350 dex, 150 int, and a tier 5 int gem. with 500 dex and a tier 5 int gem, with 500 dex without a gem, and then with 500 dex and a diamond. Now you may be wondering why a diamond, because a diamond scales almost the same as 1% off as an emerald. And due to the gem changes next patch, I believe that emerald will be the gold standard, especially for weapons like the bow, though in this case I used the diamond instead because it's just much easier to test with the same outcome essentially. And then I averaged the damage output between no gem and using the diamond, and then we would have what the damage would be like with 50% emerald uptime, which is half the enemy's health, so it adds up very easily here. For the last test with the Syncretic Bow, I also tested 500 int. I had 43 dex here, it doesn't actually have any effect, but I noted it behind that. This is because now you can fully scale weapons with int with much better scaling than before. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail tomorrow, but I wanted to include it here to see how it adds up for the bow in particular. And then we have our Boltcaster options. The first Boltcaster option that I did is pretty much the standard that everyone uses at the moment, with 350 dex and 150 int. Then I also tried 500 dex, and I also tried 500 int, just to be sure that there's no hidden tech with that. I also additionally tried 300 dex and 150 int, and 300 dex and 150 int on the Boltcaster, just to see what happens in that case. Now I have a little question for you. You'll see 3 numbers on the screen. One of them belongs to the Syncretic Bow with 350 dex, 150 int, and the tier 5 int gem. One of them belongs to the 500 dex version of that build, and one of them belongs to the Boltcaster with 350 dex and 150 int. Which of these numbers do you think is the one that is the Boltcaster's damage output? Feel free to pause the video here and write in the comments and then see if you're right, because I thought the results here were pretty interesting. I'm going to show you just the full table right here, right now in 3, 2, 1. There it is. As you can see, the Boltcaster in fact has the highest damage output out of all of these weapons, at least on average. The Diamond or Emerald could deal higher damage, but only below 50% health. On average, it does less damage. It's not by an insane amount. We're looking at 2,861 here, but it's the highest number that we have here. Going through these real quick, we can see that our standard loadout at the moment with 350 dex and 150 int and a tier 5 int gem is 2,700 damage. This is in light armor, just a light shot, or like a right-click light shot with the bow on the body of a target dummy. And then the same thing for the 500 dex with the int gem is 2,675 damage. The average for both a non-gemmed and a diamond/emerald is 2,834.5 damage. With 500 int, we get a surprising 2,572, so it's really not that far off. And then again, the Boltcaster gets 2,861. With 500 dex, the Boltcaster drops off just a little bit to 2,709, and with full int, it only deals 1,071 damage, so that's definitely not an option. For good measure, here are the values for 300 dex as well. If you're interested, you can see that the Boltcaster benefits a lot more from the 150 int here with the elemental damage. And as you can see, this is factoring in the attunement, which you cannot have on the Boltcaster, but on the other hand, it is not including the Shocking Lightning that you have on the Boltcaster, so in many situations where you're dodging something, the Boltcaster can actually deal even more damage. On that note, in an int build with an int gem, the attunement only seems to scale with half of your damage, so that is something worth keeping in mind. That's why the damage output here is a little bit lower, and without attunement it would be a bit more even. To put things into perspective, I also wanted to test ability damage though, and I did this with Rain of Arrows, just same thing, same conditions, and tested the most relevant ones that I think are the ones that are actually worth considering. With 350 dex and 150 int and an int gem, we ended up with 3,524 damage for Rain, whereas with 500 dex with an emerald, the average damage would be 3,947.5. With 500 in, it would be 3,649. Again, the attunement is cutting into this a little bit more, otherwise it would be even more even. And then the Boltcaster is 3,815. Again, there are no other damage increasing perks involved here, like rings or harnessing. It's just that depending on how an ability scales and how exactly that scales with your base values, you can see these different results. So something that deals the most damage in a light attack may not necessarily deal the most damage in ability. The overall main conclusion of these numbers should be that the Boltcaster doesn't decrease your damage. It can in some situations increase it, but it's not going to be something that is a significant trade-off where you're generally expecting a damage loss. Against the current standard build of a split with an int gem, it usually comes out on top. But the current standard build would technically also fall below the 500 dex build, and it's still more popular, and that is because it is split damage, and split damage is nice because it's harder to counter. Thrust protection is popular, so splitting your damage into something elemental is beneficial. That is not the case for the Boltcaster, which doesn't really do thrust damage, because it's almost entirely lightning damage. That comes with benefits and with downsides. The benefit is that you can increase the damage of this more significantly than anything else really. Because on one hand you have the lightning damage, and unlike an elemental gem, this affects 100% or 99% of your damage because it's all lightning. But on the other hand, different from a 500 dex build with thrust damage, you have more increases beyond that because you can also make use of harnessing, which gives you additional damage increases, and harnessing does not exist for thrust damage. So of all bows, the Boltcaster has the most potential increases. At the same time, it is also the most countered, because at least technically, I haven't fully tested this, but it should be countered by both Enchanted Ward and Elemental Aversion. Now this would be a bigger argument if those pieces could actually be used together, but they can't, with the exception of the new illegal gear from the dungeon that I recently talked about, but that's only for heavy. So most players won't really be able to negate this much more significantly than other damage output, especially not if you're pairing this with harnessing and with the lightning damage effect. Most builds also can't afford to invest specifically into lightning protection as an amulet, because typically there are too many other damage sources that you also need to worry about that are more universal. For example, you have fire damage, which avoids both blunderbuss as well as fire staff. You have thrust damage, which counters a variety of weapons to some degree. And you have void damage, which counters the Great Axe Grafwell in general, counters the Abyss specifically, and counters the Void Gauntlet. So those are much more all-rounder, whereas lightning is very much specifically against the bow because no one's using Mjolnir. But what Boltcaster also does, which is probably the only thing that is significantly reining it in, is that it doesn't allow you to use it along with another artifact. Most bow players at the moment are either using Finisher and making use of the 15% extra damage for bleeding targets, or are using Life Taker and are utilizing the additional damage over time and rend that you get from that. Finisher is more suitable for dummy tests, and you can see the result of that here. This would result in 2,979 damage with our first build, which is slightly above the damage output of Boltcaster. Don't worry, the int bonus for 50 int was always factored in, so that's not exclusive for this one, so that's pretty even. That effectively means if we factor in an artifact in our offhand, which you will usually have with a bow if you're not using Boltcaster, then we can get some more damage out of that, and we can kind of outclass the damage output of Boltcaster just slightly, but that damage loss is then offset by the harnessing, so pros and cons back and forth. You can kind of see it balances out here and there, and depending on how you want to look at it, which passives you want to apply, is there a bleed stack currently, for example, and so on, you can kind of shift it back and forth. But what stays the same is that the secondary passive, the stun of Boltcaster, is extremely strong for a bow that at worst comes with relatively minimal trade-offs compared to a standard bow. That in combination with a completely unique kind of damage that is not really relevant anywhere else does concern me. As it stands, most other artifacts come with significant trade-offs. Artifacts like Scorpion Sting have a bad secondary perk. The Abyss is only really top tier when ran with a weapon that actually uses mana. The Deep Freeze artifact only works well if you're actually using Wind Chill, and so on and so on. There's always some reason to consider other options as well, and I don't really think that is the case for Boltcaster. I don't think Boltcaster comes with any of these necessary trade-offs. You just have very similar damage as a normal bow build, a strong bow build with a best in slot bow, and you also have some bonus shirking damage along with that sometimes maybe, and you also have an extremely strong secondary passive. Honestly, Boltcaster would probably still be an option that players would be considering if it didn't even have the secondary passive at all. It's just very different from the Warhammer, where you can easily commit into a mix of Dex and Int because that's what people are already doing, because it's a ranged weapon. As I said before, I personally much prefer if they made this a more interesting PvE option, because that's, I think, more of a weak spot of the bow still. And somebody suggested in my comments that you could, for example, make it a chain effect. That could be something that would be useful in PvE. They've mostly taken chain out because of the performance issues tied to that, but if it was only one weapon using it, I don't think that would be nearly as much of a problem, considering they left it on the old weapons that had chain as well. But that's just one of the aspects of the elemental damage. We still have to talk about the int gems, which are absolutely crazy on the new patch, and that is what we're going to do tomorrow, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you want to get notified of that. If you'd like to support me further and get early tips and trading tips in return, then consider doing so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. SLOTH out.